Good afternoon again, everyone. My name is Vitaly Chernetsky. I'm the director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies here at the University of Kansas. And it's a great pleasure and honor to welcome you to our annual conference on security-related issues that has already been running for a number of years, and we are very glad that this tradition continues strongly. This is a joint endeavor between KU and Foreign Military Studies Office at Fort Leavenworth, and we are, as always, really grateful to our colleagues at Fort Leavenworth for their support. Here at the University of Kansas, together with our Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, I would like to acknowledge our co-sponsors, who are the Office of Graduate Military Programs, Center for Global and International Studies, and the Department of Political Science. I'm going to start with just a couple of small housekeeping announcements. First, I hope everyone had a chance to get a program. We will begin with an opening keynote, and I will say a few words introducing our keynote speaker in a couple of minutes. We will then have a break, and then after the break, we will have two panels. There'll be a question and answer session after each panel, and a break between them. In the back, you've noticed that there is a table from the University Bookstore with some books related to the theme of our conference, and some of the speakers available for sale. The books will be available during breaks only, so that we will not disturb the panels. So if you haven't had the chance to avail yourself of those opportunities, do not despair. The books have been packed, but they will be unpacked and available again later on. Also, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the wonderful staff members who have ensured that we have a wonderful event here. First of all, my assistant director, the assistant director of CREES. He's not just my assistant director, Bart Redford, who is standing at the back door. Thank you, Bart, for all the wonderful and hard work that you do. And Bart is an important person for everyone to note also, because if you're planning to join conference participants at Merchants this evening, it's an optional no-host dinner where everyone contributes her or his participation, but we will need to notify the restaurant how many people are going, so please do let Bart know. I would also like to acknowledge Chad O'Brien, who is now our cameraman extraordinaire, as well as Abby, our work study student in the back, and Jen Duhamel, who is helping us out from the Center for Global International Studies, and the help, of course, from the university in making sure that there is a video recording of our conference capture. So, as you see, we are a smooth, well-oiled, well-running machine, and we intend to continue it that way. Now, moving forward, it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Adrian Karatnitsky, who is currently a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Dinu Patriciu Eurasia Center and managing partner of Myrmidon Group, a New York-based consultancy that works with investors and corporations seeking entry into the emerging markets of Ukraine and Eastern Europe. He is also the founder and co-director of the nonprofit, the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter. Adrian Karatnitsky has a distinguished, lengthy career as an activist, an analyst, championing very important causes. already in his student days at Columbia University, and he is a native New Yorker. It's wonderful that we've been able to lure somebody who was born on the island of Manhattan and have never been to Kansas before to come to our conference. So already back in his student days, Adrian was involved in spreading the information on political prisoners held by the Soviet Union and championing their cause. In the 1980s, he was very actively involved with helping the solidarity movement in Poland. For those of you who are familiar with history of Eastern Europe, it was a very important independent free trade union association that arose at the time, spearheaded mass protests, and the leader of that group, Lech Wałęsa, eventually became president of non-communist Poland. So for nearly 7 years, our keynote speaker was director of research for AFL-CIO's Free Trade Union Institute. And then in the post-communist period, he has also for many years, for over 12 years, he was the president and executive director of Freedom House, a very important organization that monitors the situation of democracy and public freedoms around the world. So he directed the benchmark survey, Freedom in the World, and co-editor of the annual Nations and Transit Study of Reform in the Post-Communist World. Adrian Karatnitsky served as the co-director of the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations Task Force on the U.S. and the United Nations, which resulted in a very important report. He was the co-director of the first World Forum on Democracy in 2000, as well as a member of the United Nations Blue Ribbon Commission on Ukraine in 2005. He has all in all co-authored and edited over 20 books focused on the post-communist region and global trends in reform. A renowned expert on Ukraine and the broader East European and Eurasian regions. He is a regular contributor to Foreign Affairs, The Washington Post, Newsweek, The Wall Street Journal, and numerous other publications. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Adrian Karatnitsky.
Thank you for that very detailed introduction, so detailed that I'd forgotten some of the things that I was involved in, but much appreciated. So let me engage. As I say, a great pleasure to be here, and very pleased to see that topics that are at the center of the world's quest for stability are discussed in the American heartland. My talk is going to be focused, will be a sort of a general discussion of Ukraine's efforts to grapple with its security needs, beginning with its independence and sort of morphing as challenges evolved and as Russia's positions towards Ukraine in particular hardened, but also I'll talk a little bit about the domestic pillars of Ukraine's national security, because these are always the most essential for the survival and the vibrancy of states. So let me start by, at the very beginning, which is for Ukraine, the collapse of the Soviet Union in the putsch of August 1991. And really from the outset of the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine's leaders have been facing the challenge of preserving their country's integrity and national sovereignty. There is a book that will be for sale. It was very presciently placed on the left-hand side of the table over there, Serhiy Plokhy's book, The Last Empire. Professor Plokhy, who I know has been to Kansas fairly recently, wrote a book based on archival materials related to the last days of the Soviet Union and the first days of the emergence of 15 independent post-Soviet states. And in that book, it's very clear that even as early as 1991, President Boris Yeltsin wanted to preserve initially a Slavic union of Russia with Ukraine and Belarus, separate from the USSR. That proved unattainable because primarily of the positions of the leaders of the Ukrainian state, of the Ukrainian proto-state at that time. At that point, he reverted to a second position of trying to pry away, interestingly, the Crimea and eastern parts of Ukraine, including the Donbass. This was the discourse that already at the very beginning is going on with the liberal anti-imperial reformers that are building the new Russia. It is embedded in the Russian discourse from the very outset of the collapse of the Soviet Union. At that time, skillful diplomacy, some dysfunction in Russia, and also the sort of bureaucratic tussle between Yeltsin and the old Soviet elite, the disintegrating Soviet elite, but one that nevertheless created an obstacle for President Yeltsin, put these intentions and these plans on a back burner. And Ukraine's new leader, a former communist boss, but from Western Ukraine, from the Volhynia region, Leonid Kravchuk, managed to preserve Ukraine's integrity and state independence. And one instrument for that was, as you may recall, the creation of a Commonwealth of Independent States, which began as a kind of an ambiguous alliance and in which Ukraine only chose to take an associative and a more passive, play a more passive role. Ukraine adopted a minimalist interpretation of the entity, arguing that it was going to be the mechanism for a civilized divorce, but the entire, almost virtually the entire Russian elite that was with Mr. Yeltsin and opposed to Mr. Yeltsin, the more hardline leaders in the Russian political firmament, had the view that this was the reverse, that this was the mechanism for the eventual ingathering, at the very least, of the Slavic states, and more broadly, the ingathering of something like the Eurasian Union that Mr. Putin is seeking yet again to reassemble. So, from the very beginnings, Ukraine's elite, which consisted of dissidents, consisted of civic activists, but was largely dominated by former Red directors and former communist officials who saw a kind of a challenge or an opportunity to accrue new power in an independent state. They all began to understand that they are dealing with neighbors who have a very different view about their new path to statehood. And we all spoke with great admiration that there was a rather civilized and peaceful disintegration of the Soviet Union. There was, to be sure, there were a couple regional conflicts that were flaring here and there, but in general, the breakup of this immense system proceeded fairly neatly and nimbly. But the origins of this attitude of a desire for unity, of Slavic unity among the Belarusian, Ukrainian, and Russian peoples was a trope or a narrative that was embedded in Russian discourse historically, since really not from time immemorial or from the origins of the Kievan Rus state, but really from the latter half of the 17th century, when Cossack statelets or Cossack entities tried to establish their own independent state and political power. And in the early stages of this revolt led by Cossack hetmans and Cossack leaders, there began to emerge a narrative in Moscow and St. Petersburg about a single Russian people divided into three strands: the White Russian strand, the Little Russian strand, or the Ukrainian strand, and the Great Russian strand. And these tropes and ideas remained a fixture of thinking inside Russia throughout the imperial period, and were revived in more recent times. So Ukrainian leaders who did not necessarily share this this sense of single identity, and the Ukrainian people, moreover, who did not share that sense of identity, confronted a national security challenge from the very moment of Ukraine's birth. And they confronted it in three dimensions. There was the rather large military presence and military threat around around Ukraine's borders from Russia. They confronted it as an economic threat because the disruption of relations between Ukraine and Russia could have very dire consequences for the Ukrainian state. And they confronted the soft power cultural threat because many people in Ukraine, particularly in Ukraine's east, had over the centuries and certainly over the last 3/4 of a century of Soviet rule, accepted this narrative of a related set of peoples, of an intimately related set of peoples, and so on. So the Ukrainian project of building an independent state and the nation building engaged all of these dimensions: the military, the foreign policy, the economic, and the cultural dimensions. And the deep-seated antipathy to the Ukrainian project, the project of the Ukrainian independent state, was something that was palpable. I've spent many years, both in my work at Freedom House and more recently in business in the Atlantic Council, interacting with Ukraine's political elites. Over the years, I've met, the oligarchs, the heads of state, the people who are the practitioners of foreign policy, et cetera, and have seen the evolution, and both at first hand and certainly through documentary work and reading through documents and research and the like, but really at first hand seeing how this relationship was emerging. And I would say that even in the mid-90s and late 90s, when you had Ukraine pursuing what was called a multi-vector foreign policy, Ukraine was not declaring that its intention was to be part of NATO or to be part of the West or to join the European Union. Ukraine had much more modest ambitions of equally friendly relations east and west, illusions that it could play a role as a kind of a bridge between these two countries, be a kind of a pivotal logistical center for east-west trade more broadly. Those were the dominant ideas in the Ukrainian state, and yet by the late 90s, when I spoke with then Foreign Minister Boris Tarasyuk, who was the foreign minister to, in effect, a Red director, Leonid Kuchma, who had led the Ukraine's missile production plant, the Southern Machine Building plant that built all of the missiles that menaced the intercontinental ballistic missiles that menaced North America, the United States, and which preoccupied our leaders as a security challenge. This leader, who was Russophone in his origins, who came from an area that was traditionally very friendly to Russia, his foreign minister was saying that fully 50% of the activity of Ukraine's foreign ministry at that time was focused on dealing and coping with Russian pressures, with the Russian question, and with the Russian threat that as they perceived it. Similar views were voiced to me by Volodymyr Horbulin, who remains today an important player in Ukraine's foreign policy, another graduate of the Dnipropetrovsk missile institutions. And Horbulin early on was telling me and telling others in writing that the Russian elite does not accept Ukrainian independence, that it is intent on finding and probing and finding weaknesses and trying to reverse the legacy of the disintegration of the Soviet Union. At that time, Ukraine tried, in the 90s, mid-90s and so on, Ukraine tried, as I said, a policy of geopolitical neutrality. They tried to resolve all of their border issues with Russia in a very quiet and systematic way without any flare-ups. They divided up the Black Sea Fleet on an equitable basis, and then Ukraine sold the majority of that fleet back to Russia. They signed long-term relationships giving Russia basing rights, et cetera, et cetera. So they tried to manage. And they searched for new alliances. One of the core ambitions of Ukraine's foreign policy and search for security in the 90s was this idea of of two alliances. One was a Visegrad process, which would unite Kiev, Prague, Warsaw, Budapest in a cooperative alliance, but that project stalled as these other states began to move more forcefully and fulsomely into the EU and into NATO. And then the second was an alliance of Georgia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Moldova, called Guam, that again was never really attained any momentum as a security institution, and the people who were running it came from more the national security side, and they didn't really understand how it could potentially be an instrument of economic cooperation. So again, even though Ukraine became the headquarters of this entity called Guam, this association had died on the vine and had no dramatic or practical applications. And in the first years, you had a bit of confusion as the Ukrainian elite kind of digested all of these issues. But things began to move categorically in a different direction when the old post-communist elite began to be challenged by 2001, 2002, 2003, elites that came out of civic society, new political forces more steeped primarily from central and western Ukraine in a more, I would say, patriotic nationalist discourse, and who united around then a prime minister who had been Viktor Yushchenko, who was appointed by Mr. Kuchma primarily to be because he had been the head of the central bank and had helped tame inflation, but was brought in for technocratic reasons. But Mr. Yushchenko also had family connections and a diaspora-born wife that was the bearer of, I would say, more firmly westernizing ideas, and the discourse around NATO membership in the EU became a mantra that began to be discussed inside the Ukrainian political discourse with increasing vigor, even though if you looked at the polling data, most Ukrainians didn't quite get it. Both those ambitions were supported by a distinct minority that nevertheless, in a majority, elected Mr. Yushchenko president in remember the Orange Revolution, a controversial election where there was voter fraud. It was reversed, and Mr. Yushchenko was elected president. Mr. Yushchenko came in with a team that wanted to move vigorously and briskly towards NATO and towards the EU, a kind of unrealistic assumption in the case of the EU, because without a full understanding of all of the mechanisms and the long path, and also the frame of mind of a Europe that had felt it had already expanded fairly vigorously. But in any event, when Mr. Yushchenko came into power, his first visit, and again, he came into power even though Mr. Putin had put in all of his eggs with Mr. Yanukovych, his then campaign rival, Mr. Yushchenko paid a mission to traveled to Moscow to reassure Mr. Putin about the modalities of Ukraine's search for NATO. And one of the things he put on the table was that Ukraine was ready to enter into a treaty relationship with Russia that would guarantee that there would never be any forward basing of foreign troops on Ukrainian soil if Ukraine were to join the NATO alliance. That it would be purely a defensive mechanism, not something that would bring more military forces closer to the Russian border. And yet as he informed me, Mr. Putin was blithely uninterested in any discussion about this. There was no issue for him because he was unremittingly opposed. And Russia began to then dramatically scale up its use of soft power because Russian television was quite influential. You had the birthing or the rebirthing of this idea of what is called Ruski Mir, the re-emphasis of the old tropes from the Cossack era of the one Rus people. As early as 2008, Mr. Putin, in an April meeting with President George W. Bush, announces that Ukraine, the trope that he has been commenting on more recently, Ukraine is not a real state, the Ukrainians are not a real nation, et cetera, et cetera. So very early on not early on in the Putin administration, but very early on in the kind of mid 2000s and the aughts, you see already the repetition of these themes that explode in some of the problems that Ukraine faces today. The major, if you look at one of the instruments that Russia used to exert destabilizing pressure on Ukraine, one of the main agencies of this was the energy tool, the weapon of gas and Ukraine's significant gas dependency on Russian natural gas. And if you map the times that conflicts around the gas issue erupt, they tend to be at a time when power is in the hands of, is not shared, but the power is in the hands of people who have a more, I would say, nationalist, independent, and Western orientation. So at the beginning of 2006, very early on, a couple years into the Yushchenko administration, Russian gas supplies are cut off on Ukrainian territory. And if you map it around what is going on politically, you will see that Putin uses the gas issue to destabilize Ukraine's economy, to make Ukraine seem an unreliable intermediary country for Europe, to shock Europe into silence about Russian pressures. And then when, as in the period of 2006 to 2008, Ukraine has a new parliamentary election. Mr. Yanukovych, the old presidential candidate and a former prime minister of a more pro-Russian accommodationist position, who comes from the eastern Donbass, comes into power. There's a period of relative quiescence. Mr. Yanukovych is forced out of office because he was in charge of a minority government, and a new government is convened, and there is a new election that is forced, and a new government led by Yulia Tymoshenko comes. Again, the gas weapon is reignited as an instrument, and again, only at the end of 2009, when another election is about to approach, does Russia reach some accommodation with the government of Yulia Tymoshenko, and many people believe that that accommodation is reached because Russia at this point is interested in having a get-along prime minister, a get-along president, no matter who is elected. And the deal that is struck with Yulia Tymoshenko is very favorable to her for the first year of the deal, right before the elections, relatively low prices for gas that help her candidacy at a time of economic difficulty, but that create a challenge. But also it has Mr. Yanukovych running as president, so in a sense they have reached an accommodation with one candidate and know that they have an accommodation with the second candidate. Now, as Ukraine is moving on its path, we have towards NATO and the EU, skepticism and difficulty encounter the Ukrainian ambitions. It's clear that Ukraine is not measuring up in its reform process to the standards of the European Union. It's clear that after the Russian intervention in Georgia, there is a certain healthy skepticism that emerges among many of the NATO countries about the risks that would be entailed in absorbing Ukraine or offering Ukraine NATO membership. So Ukrainian foreign policy efforts of a 6 or 7 year period end up kind of collapsing, and Ukraine then again returns to a multi-vector foreign policy. You have the election of Mr. Yanukovych over Mrs. Tymoshenko on a new path, but yet again, he reverts policy back to the multi-vector approach. His first visit is not to Russia, it's to the United States. He reaches a good accommodation on cooperation on the further removal, thank you, of nuclear grade, the residue from dismantled nuclear weapons and its proper disposal, which the U.S. and at this point President Obama cheers on. There is an opening to China, an attempt to diversify the Ukrainian economy, and even some modest reduction in gas dependency that Mr. Yanukovych pursues. But fundamentally, he returns Ukrainian policy in 2011, 2012, not to a pure pro-Russian path, but to this multi-vector vector path, while at the same time saying no to NATO, but yes to European integration. And Ukraine begins to, again, see another process under Mr. Yanukovych. First, it is the appearance in the Ukrainian state of Russian nationals who are hired, people who have been Russian citizens 5, 6, 7 years before, have shifted their citizenship not at the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union, but become Ukrainian citizens only a few years before being appointed to high office, and they take over as the head of the State Security Service, Mr. Kalinin. They take over as the head of the Ukrainian intelligence, the Ukrainian military-industrial complex, Ukroboronprom, the weapons production company, and the head of the personal guard, the bodyguards, the Secret Service of Mr. Yanukovych is not only a recent Ukrainian citizen, he's not even that. He is a Russian national who is hired to protect Mr. Yanukovych. At the same time, you see a drastic scaling down of Ukrainian military expenditures, the diversion of that budgetary money to the growing corrupt appetites of the Yanukovych clan, and you have kind of a general weakening of Ukraine's defense posture at a time of rising corruption and economic difficulties. And then, as is well known, Mr. Yanukovych reverses a path that he had led for several years, and at the last minute pulls out of discussions about integration into a European free trade area, cuts a deal where he gets a $15 billion line of credit from Mr. Putin. And again, Ukrainian foreign policy seems to be reversing and pivoting yet another time. So we're moving from multi-vector policy to pro-NATO policy to multi-vector policy, and then out to a policy of reintegration with Russia and the Russian world. All of this is accompanied with Russian soft power. All of this is accompanied with heavy emphasis on the intervention and the engagement of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Moscow Patriarch Kirill, a lot of sort of cultural politics, an attempt to play the red state, blue state pattern in Ukraine, only the red state, blue state is not a matter of political values, it's a matter of national identity, and the playing of the Russian-speaking world of Ukraine versus the Ukrainophone population, the East versus West. All of those kinds of things reemerge in Ukrainian politics and pose a security threat. And prior to Mr. Yanukovych and his last term in office, those issues had been relatively deftly overcome, and with the decline of the Ukrainian Communist Party in the early 2000s, there had not really been such a vigorous championing of this cultural divide and this desire to reintegrate with Russia until Mr. Yanukovych pivots. And Mr. Yanukovych has, when he is in power from 2010 in his presidency, has a range of political interests inside his group. Not everyone inside the Yanukovych leadership supports this path. You have to remember that the current president of Ukraine, Mr. Poroshenko, serves as a minister in the Yanukovych government for several years as a minister of the economy. There are people who have patriotic orientations that are in that alliance that Mr. Yanukovych creates, and many of them are surprised at his pivot to Putin, although others say that if you look at what he did in national security, what he did in defense, the writing was on the wall, the evidence was there that he was going to be taking the country in that direction. Well, full stop, the people, students come out onto the streets, as we know, students come out into, are beaten badly, and protesters are beaten badly. The Ukrainian media, to the surprise of many, television in particular, cover these beatings in great detail and in great regularity. The population of Kiev gets riled up, and hundreds of thousands of people appear in the streets. You have the fighting and so on. So this is all the backdrop, but it has all sorts of consequences for today's Ukrainian development of Ukraine's national security, identity and national security challenges. Because number one, it triggers the Russian annexation of Crimea. It reveals the weakness, the fundamental weakness of Ukraine's A, procurement policies, B, its military capabilities, up to the point that if you read the transcripts of the leaders who take over after Mr. Yanukovych flees in early 2004 in the first gatherings of the Ukrainian National Security Council, the discussion is that they basically have a reliable military force of among the 100,000 or so combat-ready forces, that they are not combat-ready, that there are about 6,000 troops in all of Ukraine that can be reliably counted on, and that it would be a folly to try to push back on the Russian movement to take over Crimea. Similarly, when the conflict emerges in eastern Ukraine, at first it is, these green men who are on the cover of the conference program, as well as local pro-Russian activists who've been part of Russia's and the pro-Russian Ukrainian elites' long-term activities during the Yanukovych years, these sort of gangs, criminal gangs that merged with pro-Russian political interests, generally very fringe groups, but thousands of these people who are in play and in tow, and there is this grand theater of demands for independence, taking over of government buildings, quickly followed by well-mobilized and well-trained green men. So all of these kinds of things, and then the war that erupts in the Donbass and the takeover, they all have a kind of a definitive effect on Ukraine's national security agenda. So today, the Ukrainian public, unlike the views that the indefinite views of multi-vector policy, leaning towards Russia, leaning toward the West, those issues have been resolved. All regions of Ukraine are dramatically for integration into the West to the maximum extent possible. NATO membership is supported by by a 3-2 margin across the board in the country, and supported in very substantial numbers in all regions. And the view of Russia as a threat, as opposed to Russia as a fraternal nation, is a view held by a very distinct minority, and even a minority inside the occupied Donbass. Polling that has been done, and of course we can't say how reliable it is because it is not a completely free political environment in the East, nevertheless shows that 40 or 50% of the people who currently live in the occupied areas of Ukraine's East support reintegration with Ukraine. So the Ukrainian political elite has been handed by Mr. Putin a terrible challenge of a well-weaponized political threat and military threat on its eastern borders, and the loss of 7% of its territory. At the same time, it has had a consolidating effect on the public, which means that Ukraine's search for a new foreign policy paradigm, a new security policy paradigm, it can be shaped with some degree of confidence. So the first thing that Ukraine has done clearly in the face of a military challenge has been to revive its military capabilities. The Ukrainian military, which had been down to about 100,000, is back up to about 250,000 combat-ready and reasonably well-provisioned fighters. The Ukrainian military budget, which had gone down to about $3 billion, is back up to about $5 billion. It's 5% of GDP. So there's been this isn't a gigantic amount, but for a poor country like Ukraine, which has an official GDP of a bit under 100 billion, this is reasonably capable. There is also some new capacity in weapons production. New tanks are rolling off the assembly lines, armored personnel carriers. They've upgraded their anti-tank weapons. They're working with Poles on weaponized drones. So a lot of ingenuity, some of it involving volunteers, some of it involving collaboration between the private sector and civically minded private sector and technologists, and so on. So let me kind of conclude and sort of say what are the key priorities that Ukraine is now facing, and what are the key ideas that are being discussed. The first dimension of the today's search for stability, as I say, occurs in an environment where the Ukrainian people are not really divided east and west. They have a more sober idea of who their neighbor to the east is, of who Russia is. And so the task of national consensus on a national historical narrative, the idea of patriotism through an intelligent and unifying narrative that emphasizes long-standing Ukrainian traditions and aspirations for statehood, or at the very minimum of sovereignty and self-governance, is gaining ground. And in fact, the new Prime Minister of Ukraine, Volodymyr Groysman, said that he would take direct charge of Ukraine's cultural portfolio in the new government because, as he put it, culture is that basic thing that allows us to have confidence in our own capabilities, to feel a sense of interrelatedness, and so it is essential to the task in a time when there is an immense security challenge. Secondly, as I said, significant reinvestment in the military and increases in the budget. Third, there is the attempt to use various mechanisms, friends, public diplomacy, and proper diplomacy to make the case for Western military assistance, including lethal weaponry, for helping Ukraine in the period before it is able to develop either unilateral or multilateral military industrial development, improving interoperability with NATO and adhering to NATO standards, not simply because they have the aspirations of NATO, but because they realize these are better techniques, and also because they also are thinking about other alliances with other countries around their border that have a heightened sense of urgency from the Russian threat, and I'll talk about that very briefly in a few minutes. A real revival of seeking strategic partners, particularly in Poland and now in Turkey, for its military-industrial production and also its aviation sector, which are extremely important. The challenge of integrating a lot of the volunteers who fought on the front early on, and integrating them into these volunteer detachments into regular units of both the National Guard troops and the regular Army fighting forces and special forces, and also to disarming some of those groups from the far right who are undisciplined. The challenge of energy security, which, as I mentioned, was a long-term means for political disruption and political pressure upon Ukraine, and to the point that if you look at the statistics of Ukrainian energy use, part of it is dictated by the loss of the industrial facilities in the east, which were heavy energy guzzling. But in any event, in 2011, Ukraine was importing 40 billion cubic meters of gas, which roughly was like $10 billion, $12 billion price tag, sometimes 16 billion annual price tag for an economy. As you will recall, that's $100 billion. Down in 2012 to 33 billion, down in 2013, and this is even under Mr. Yanukovych, to 25 billion, down after the Donbass was segregated or separated out of Ukraine, to 14 billion cubic meters, and last year 6 to 7 billion cubic meters as opposed to 40. And this year, for the first 125 days as of April 1st, Ukraine imported not a single cubic meter of Russian gas. It was importing gas from Western Europe. It was relying on some of its own domestic extraction. It was a combination of greater energy efficiency, but also new markets. It signed a 5 billion cubic meter deal with Norway. These are really essential components of building a economic security, an economic national security dimension. And then that means a stronger bargaining position vis-a-vis Russia, and of course the fact that the market in gas has dramatically changed to the benefit of consumers. Then I would say the other dimension is the other part of a widening sense of awareness that all of society has to be engaged in diplomacy, a rediscovery of a very conservative foreign policy establishment of the need for second-track diplomacy, the use of Ukrainian soft power, of its cultural attractiveness, of its struggle on the Maidan for democracy as branding instruments in pleading their case and in building political support. And using that kind of soft power also to the end of more vigorous lobbying in support of maintaining a sanctions regime on Russia for its occupation of Crimea and for the ongoing Russian prosecution of a war in Ukraine's east. All those instruments being a fairly important dimension of Ukraine's national security toolkit at a time when the Russian economy declined about 4.5% in 2015, and the predictions are dependent on which way you think gas and oil prices are headed. But a Russian economy that is in decline, 1.5% to 2.5%. Some people say if the price fell below again $30, it could be a return to another 4% decline this year. But most importantly, any prognosis of Russia's future at gas prices that the market believes will not go beyond, say, $50, $60 suggests that Russia will be a stagnating economy through 2020 with no real prospect of greater growth. And that's for a variety of reasons. One is Russia's over dependence on commodities and on oil and gas as a source of export revenue. The second is the lack of attractiveness to a very rigidly state-controlled discourse and state intrusiveness in individual life, which I think is particularly unattractive to the kind of the sort of entrepreneurial and technologically driven component of Russian society, which unlike the rest of the Russian people doesn't feel comfortable with this type of intrusiveness and has a bit of a libertarian streak, as do those segments of most societies. And then the other is, as Joseph Nye has pointed out, is purely demographic. Russia just has the wrong demography. If you look at what countries grow, in addition to getting things right like economic policy and so on, demography is a very important factor. It can be disaggregated. I'm not an economist, so I haven't done the disaggregations. But if you look at the logic of it, Russia, the population that drives economic growth, the people who are hardest working, and I hate to break it to college students, because you're going to be working hard for the next 25 years. It's people the age of 21 to 45 who work the hardest, who are the most motivated to start new projects, to venture forward with new, and their relative wage to their effort is economically efficient for society. They've not accumulated all of the accumulated benefits that make them, even against their own will, less efficient. And they're certainly motivated because they're starting families, they're building their lives, they're trying to accumulate, they're trying to buy themselves out of debt, and so on. But the point is that in the Russian population today, the 21 to 45 cohort is just over 20%. In the United States, and that's why we can be optimistic about the United States, it's just under 33%. So a dramatic difference of the type of that cohort of the population. And one of the reasons why a lot of people are optimistic that US growth will continue, but that Russia is headed for a long-term period of not just stagnation, but decline, which gives Ukrainian diplomacy and this effort to maintain pressure on Russia until it behaves in a more intelligent way, an important vehicle. The other dimension that is now being addressed by Ukraine is lawfare, the use of litigation to challenge against Russia's takeover of Ukrainian companies, illegal occupation of its territories, and the back and forth. The Ukrainian Naftogaz is suing, and Russia is, of course, countersuing, but the Ukrainians feel they have a good case of about $30 billion on Russia for overcharging and underpayments for gas transiting fees. So Ukraine has launched this. And then another, I'm close to concluding, another weapon in the quiver of national security is that Ukraine today is a bilingual country with a Russian and Ukrainian, even though Ukrainian is the state language, but casually Russian is an equally important cultural language, and informally is the second language of the country. And Russian, there is a discourse about democracy, a discourse about civil society that's occurring in Russian among Ukrainians and also among transplanted Russian journalists and Russian writers who feel less and less free and comfortable inside Russia. And this community is giving Ukraine, I would say, some additional influence and power, soft power, because the place where discourse on democracy occurs in the Russian language primarily is today in Ukraine. The final dimensions of national security for Ukraine are obviously the revival of economic growth and the defeat of corruption, which is a great drag on growth and has been one of the reasons of temptation of portions of the Ukrainian elite to play with Russia. And finally, and this is where I will conclude, is the tantalizing idea of new alliances on a bilateral and unilateral basis. It is the great advantage of Ukraine that at a time where it is not being offered NATO membership, there are other countries on its rim, in particular Poland, that have begun discussing a long-held idea of Marshal Pilsudski of the Intermarium, an alliance of countries between the Baltic, and in that case the Adriatic, but the Baltic and the Black Seas, which would engage Romania, Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states, and maybe if politics change in places like Hungary and in the Czech Republic and in Slovakia, these could be a group of countries that cooperate in terms of military, industrial cooperation, perhaps in some deeper security way. And then there is the additional bilateral opportunity and maybe eventually multilateral opportunity offered by the tension between Mr. Erdogan and Mr. Putin, and also the tension between Russia and Turkey, which creates another opportunity. The Prime Minister of Prime Minister Davutoglu of Turkey visited Kiev in mid-February to sign ambitious, declarative statements about serious military industrial cooperation. As I say, Ukraine has a strong capacity in shipbuilding. It has a strong capacity in aviation. But it has no capital to realize it. It has the technical capacity for these sectors, and it used to do joint production cycles with Russia, but it's looking for new partners. So there may be new things in the works. And so I realize that time is escaping me, and someone advised me very badly on the ratio of words to lecture time. So I will conclude, and I'll say that over the last 25 years of its independence, Ukraine has had a haphazard search for the contours of an adequate national security policy. Clearly, that national security policy did not work. It may not have been able to work in the circumstances where the West was not able to meet Ukraine's needs, but Ukraine had haphazard and sometimes contradictory needs, and when it came down to it, the Ukrainian public itself, in a democracy, in a semi-democracy, was divided about what those aims were, making the search for a stable security policy difficult. At times, as I say, But the emergence of Russian revisionism, as demonstrated by the annexation of Crimea and the occupation of Ukraine's eastern territories, have consolidated the citizenry and focused the minds of the elite on new policies and solid support for Western integration and a realistic sense of the Russian threat, as well as antipathy to any new alliances with Russia that have broken the traditional left bank, right bank, east-west divide that had vexed Ukrainians since independence in 1991. In addition, the concern about Russian aggression among countries on the Russian periphery opens new opportunities for Ukraine to seek new forms of cooperation, economic and military, and such cooperation means in turn that Ukraine has an opportunity to change or pivot away from its meager record of foreign policy and security policy accomplishments, and perhaps to begin a new period of significant and bold initiatives, maybe sometimes aided by some of its neighbors like Turkey and Poland, that will enhance its security and dramatically, at least, raise the costs to further Russian military intervention and direct Russian intervention in its affairs. Since I've overstepped my time limit, we were supposed to have questions. I thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take a few questions with the permission of the chair.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. Dear colleagues, dear guests, we have probably about 5 to 7 minutes for questions to make sure that everyone can hear you.
You mean questions and answers?
Yeah, question and answers. If you could use the microphone in the central stand, please. Okay, so Professor Dinesh and then Professor Scott.
One quick question about the demography. Unfortunately, the same thing is true for Ukraine. And what would be the future or the prospect of this? And second, for the last couple of years, world trade hasn't been increasing any faster than GDP economic growth. And slow growth, the world is looking forward to slow growth. Now, is this helping or harming Ukraine, because it could be more self-sufficient in a sense of having light industries, food industries, so forth, as well as the heavy and military machine building.
Okay. Well, the first thing is I'm not an expert on impacts of international trade patterns, these sort of global, so I can't answer that question. But I can say that you're absolutely right that the demography that Ukraine faces is quite similar to Russia's. What I'm suggesting, however, is that Ukraine has some other mechanisms that it is more open. It is more. It seems to be more entrepreneurial. It seems to be having a bit of a kind of a creative renaissance somehow as a result of the challenge in the East, and these things are helpful. Ukraine has a strong high-tech capacity and perhaps can grow further in that area. It has a very strong agricultural sector that is only still believed to be at 50 or 60% of its maximum potential, and we know that even if growth is relatively not vigorous, that population growth continues, maybe not at the same dramatic paces, but that there will be markets and living standards continue to rise, even with slower growth, even in places that we are worried about, like China's relative rate of growth. So I think there are new markets for Ukraine. But I think that the main drag on the Ukrainian economy is the absence of real capital markets, partly because of corruption and the absence of the rule of law, and also the absence of credit markets for small and medium business. And unfortunately, I don't see any answer because it's not there in the IMF approach. It's not there in and then of course the Ukrainian government is constrained because if it loses the value of its currency, it doesn't stick to the IMF regimen. So there may be a little bit of a period right now with this new government that they take a little bit of a breather from the IMF because they've got $12 billion in reserves, which they may drain down by a few billion before they return to the more vigorous, and difficult IMF regimen. But I think those are the short-term problems of Ukrainian growth. But you're right that the demographics are a big problem. But on the other hand, Ukrainian economy, because of the devaluation of the hryvnia relative to the educational level of Ukrainians, creates some competitive advantages in production and in marketing and in the value of its labor force and in the margins for the businesses that are in Ukraine. So if there is some ability for Ukraine to attract a bit of capital investment, there is, I think, a reasonably, and we can change, and one can change the legal environment so that people's investments are protected. I think there's some potential for upward motion. But in the next year or two, I just don't, there is no good prognosis for Ukraine. In fact, the Ukrainian currency has historically been related, no matter what happens. The hryvnia seems to be mainly correlating with the trends in the ruble, even though the economies are now almost completely disconnected and disaggregated.
I want to ask you about something you mentioned in passing a couple of times, which is corruption. One might argue that this is perhaps a key issue at the root of Ukraine's security and future. Certainly, it was a key issue for the Euromaidan protesters. It is maybe a constant across all this changing foreign policy chart since 1991 that there's been corruption, there's been basically oligarchic control of the economy. There's an oligarch in charge now, essentially, perhaps pro-Western one, perhaps interested in some reform, but there really hasn't been any profound anti-corruption movement. I mean, they've brought in some Georgians like Saakashvili in a few positions. Are there prospects for real anti-corruption measures? What are the obstacles? I mean, how there is an anti-corruption campaign that's going to be meaningful, going to perhaps challenge some of these other priorities that you're talking about? Thanks.
Yeah. So, when we use the term corruption, we need to be more specific. And the levels of corruption in the classical sense of vast, payments to officials to advantage particular interests or to make particular findings in regulatory agencies, in government policy, in price setting, in legal decisions. Those acts of corruption are there, but they are not the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is a problem that we encounter in the West, and that is a expensive political process with no controls on campaign spending, and proxies inside the political elite and in the legislature who are proxies for a handful of very rich plutocrats. These plutocrats, in addition, control the 4 or 5 major television stations. Not all of them are necessarily corrupt, but all of them are interested in using these instruments to maximize their advantage. And unless there is some mechanism found to tame these people, and I don't think it necessarily means putting them in jail, but to make the process more resistant to this kind of influence, going after a local customs official who's trying to shake someone down, that's a terrible thing for small business. But on the big macro side, these 10 people who control, say, 35% of the Ukrainian economy, there's a different set of problems related to them. So if we disaggregate those two, then we have the problem of the legal system. And basically, the security services and the militia are pretty much doing their jobs. They're arresting and they're bringing cases. What's happening is that the procuracy is not acting upon them, partly because of corruption and because of relationships with the very people, the protection of the very people. And if it moves past the layer of the procuracy, the courts are in equal measure corrupt. So the maximalist idea of changing the entire judicial system and the entire procuracy is, in my view, unrealistic. The more realistic thing would be to create like a star chamber, a legal, non-corrupt, very well-paid group of judges that deal with corruption cases of a certain, of a medium to high level, not very small scale corruption, and a special prosecutorial unit. That prosecutorial unit has been created and it is being populated. But you still have the problem that the judiciary remains. So the answer is there are some approaches and mechanisms, and part of the system is now working. And there is a bit of a reduction of corruption because, when someone is caught in corruption, even if they're not prosecuted, they're usually removed from office. And so they're removed from their traditional way of doing, of making money. And the people who come in after them are probably a bit more circumspect in returning to those kinds of patterns. And even some anti-corruption monitors have found that even though public belief that corruption is a rising problem in Ukraine, a growing problem, is there, that's because of greater public attention to the problem. But in fact, when you ask people the question of, have you in the last year or someone in your family directly been engaged in a place where you had to engage, you were forced to do some payment or you saw the workings of a corrupt official and you have direct evidence of it, there have been 2 years of modest decline in the range of about 10% less than the previous year. So there may be some positive trends, and in fact, the fact that people think that corruption is the problem is actually a positive trend because it means there's greater public awareness. And there's also a lot of media attention to this to the point where it's now become excessive. I don't know if you saw this whole thing about the Panama Papers involving President Poroshenko, who opened up 3 vehicles for a potential sale of his assets, possibly to avoid double taxation if they were to be to an international purchaser. $3,000 changed hands, and that became an issue of the grand corruption of the president. Now, the fact that reporters messed up on the story is bad, but the fact that there was so much attention to this and it was discussed by the entire country is a good thing. The public is intolerant. The public is looking for vehicles and of venting their rage, and usually those vehicles are the next election. So I think public officials are a little more circumspect. But yes, the fundamental problem remains. But I would say in the broader economy, the big economy, the problem is state capture and rent seeking. At the middle level, it's corruption. At the middle level, it seems to have had 2 years of modest decline. And the state capture is less anyway because the economy is poor. There's just less, there's less to spread around in terms of subsidies and support.
All right. Very concise. We have Professor Gajanian, who's been waiting to ask a question. So if you could please formulate concisely, and Adrian, if you could please answer concisely, and then we'll have a short break.
I'll try to formulate a short question, but it probably would not have an easy answer. Like with any sort of emotional reactions, the reaction of the West to the Ukrainian events sort of shifted from sort of euphoria to increasing suspicion and sort of doubts and pessimism, and we've seen some evidence of it. Apparently, it will be growing, I suspect. So, how do that Western and NATO NATO and Western attitudes in general can sort of affect or derail the policies that and the ambitions of the Ukrainian leadership you've been talking about?
Well, I still think I think those are important. But I think that the West still has a large influence, and that is that it has a set of aid packages. It's providing the Ukrainians with liquidity, limited liquidity, but essential liquidity to make sure the currency is stable. Similarly, the U.S. yesterday announced, once the new government was formed, a new tranche of $1 billion in credits, et cetera, et cetera. So it seems to me that the West continues to have a fair amount of policy pressure because the Ukrainian economy is so desperately dependent on these cash transfers and on this refinancing and restructuring of their debt, and that has been used to a degree. So, for example, in the energy sector, Ukraine has, in a sense, eliminated the multi-pricing mechanisms which allowed a lot of diversion of funds from the state treasury. All Ukrainians are now paying more or less, I wouldn't call them market prices, but the global prices prices more reasonable to the actual cost of energy on the international market. And that was achieved because the IMF would just not extend credits. In terms of the long term, I think that the real problem is a domestic problem. The West can use its economic influence, but I think that the real influence is the Ukrainian electorate, and if the Ukrainian electorate becomes more sophisticated about its expectations of government leaders and doesn't fall, if it channels its discontent with corruption in the direction of good, competent public officials and clean politicians, it will push the country forward much more. But the problem is that Ukrainians have an appetite for populists, and they have an appetite for new political projects without looking at them with scrutinizing them. So it remains to be seen whether the public can help the elite break from this cycle.
All right, thank you again for being here, and welcome to those of you who are joining us. My name is Vitaly Chernetsky. I'm the director of the Center for Russian, East European, Eurasian Studies here at the University of Kansas. And our center, together with our partners and co-sponsors, is delighted to welcome you here. I also would like to make an announcement pitching some of our future events. One, since we are collaborating here with Foreign Military Studies Office at Fort Leavenworth, I thought it would only be appropriate to mention that at Fort Leavenworth, there will be another KU Fort Leavenworth collaborative panel on a similar topic, a related topic to our conference, Russia's New Generation of Warfare in Ukraine, Implications for Regional and Global Security. For those of you who can get to Fort Leavenworth, it will be on Thursday, April 21st from 12:30 to 2:30. The keynote will be by Brigadier General Eugene Leboeuf, and it will be a panel of 4 speakers, 4 from Command General Staff College, and 2 from KU, including our own Professor Maria Nelicheva and yours truly. And in another important topic related to Ukraine, on April 28th, we will have a lecture commemorating the 30th anniversary of the Chernobyl nuclear catastrophe. And our guest speaker will be Professor Adrian Ivahi from the University of Vermont, Professor of Environmental Studies there. And it's our joint event and collaboration with an environmental studies program here at KU. So I hope to see some of you there as well. In general, please follow the CREES web page, Facebook, Twitter feed, and others for announcements. Sign up for our email list. And now I will pass the chairing of the panel to my friend and colleague, Professor Shannon O'Lear from the Department of Geography and Atmospheric Science and the Environmental Studies Program and Center for Global International Studies, and of course, us, Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. Shannon.
I'm such a hassle, I know. And everything else. Thank you, Vitaly. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming on a gorgeous Friday afternoon when you all could be outside. I appreciate the fact that you're in here. Now, since we're starting a little bit later than the program, I'm going to make the executive decision to cut all y'all short so we have some Q&A time. 15 minutes? You good with that?
We'll see.
Okay. Do your best. Okay, I will simply go in the order as on the program. And so initially, kicking us off, it is my delight to present to you all Dave Trimbach, Dr. Dave Trimbach, who has just today deposited his dissertation.
Thank you.
So he will be speaking to us about his dissertation research in Narva, Estonia. And I will introduce the next speakers as they come up. So, okay, Dave, if you would take it away.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here today. Like Shannon said, my name is David Trimbach, and I am a graduating PhD candidate in the Department of Geography and Atmospheric Science. And today I'm going to be talking about some aspects and some normative findings that are derived from my doctoral research and my recently defended dissertation. And I make this distinction because some of these results and findings are actually quite new, and they aren't incorporated in my dissertation. They're actually in a forthcoming article in the journal Baltic Worlds. So while I'm not necessarily a security expert, my research does overlap with a lot of security issues and has a lot of implications with regards to the securitizing, militarizing, and geopolitical context of the former Soviet Union and the greater Baltic Sea region. Those implications are derived from my focus on citizenship in its broad conceptual sense and political power among Russian speakers in Estonia. So my population of interest are Russian speakers, and my research primarily focuses on the borderland city of Narva, which is on the border between Estonia and Russia. So I thought I would give a little bit of context, not a lot. Obviously, I could talk about this all day. But I'm just going to give a brief overview of Russian speakers and the city of Narva in Estonia. So Russian speakers are a multi-ethnic, multi-religious population. So these are individuals who use Russian as a primary everyday language. They comprise 28% of Estonia's total population, the vast majority of which are ethnic Russians. So ethnic Russians comprise 25% of Estonia's total population. Most Russian speakers are themselves or are the descendants of Soviet-era migrants. And I emphasize this term migrant and immigration because that's actually the perspective that I'm approaching this through this lens of migration, through this lens of citizenship studies. So most individuals, because of how Estonian citizenship policy shifted in the post-independence period, because these individuals were attached or affiliated with what is known as the illegal Soviet occupation of Estonia, actually were not entitled to citizenship during this post-independence period. So most Russian speakers were actually stateless in the early 1990s, meaning they weren't citizens of any country, and they didn't have any rights associated with any state. And over time, we have seen changes. Most Russian speakers have obtained some sort of citizenship status or legal residency where they live, either through naturalization or through some sort of migration. So we see Russian speakers as a fragmented citizenship or a series of fragmented citizenship status groups. Around 50% are Estonian citizens, and the other 48% comprise Russian citizens and stateless residents in Estonia. And so stateless residents have some rights, but they are not entitled to full political rights in the country. As you can see from this map, Russian speakers primarily reside in two particular counties. In Harju County, which is where the capital city and largest city of Tallinn is located, there is a very large Russian-speaking population, and Russian speakers tend to be segregated in ethno-linguistic neighborhoods, even in Tallinn at the local scale. So we see this multi-scalar concentration and segregation occurring. Additionally, Russian speakers reside in and are the majority of Ida-Viru County, which borders the Russian Federation, including in Estonia's third largest city of Narva. And in Narva, they comprise around 97% of that city's total population. And Narva is where I actually conducted most of my fieldwork through Narva College. Obviously, this population and place features quite prominently within this shifting or perhaps re-emerging, militarizing, securitizing, and geopolitical context. So we are seeing an increase in military investment and activities in the greater Baltic Sea region. We're also seeing an expansion of Russian soft powers in what some scholars note as hybrid warfare, with an example of that being Russian compatriot policies that target Russian speakers or ethnic Russians outside of the Russian Federation, in addition to this process of passportization, where a state or some sort of group gives out passports to a population in order to change how they affiliate or what their legal status is when it comes to citizenship. This has been seen actually in Georgia in 2008 and is currently being seen in eastern Ukraine. This context of militarization and securitization coalesces and blends with an increase in irredentism, so irredentist logic, discourse, and practice. This has been seen also in Georgia and in the ongoing Ukrainian crisis. And so many scholars, journalists, and security experts like myself have been interested in what other potential flashpoints are there, what other potential conflict sites might there be that share demographic, historical, or political characteristics. And so Diener has looked at northern Kazakhstan, others have looked at Moldova and Transnistria, and Professor O'Lear and I have actually looked at Narva and Estonia. And this is exemplified by a wide array or burgeoning array of media and security reports that focus on the Russian-speaking population more broadly, not just in Estonia, but in the Baltic states, and on Narva. And as someone who's been looking at this population in place since 2011, it's actually quite interesting to see how much there is out there now on Narva and on Russian speakers more broadly. So Russian speakers in Narva both are often approached in this sort of discourse as security threats, as fifth columnists, as concerns. There's a lot of usage of the term concerned in a lot of media reports. And a lot of this isn't new. If anyone looks at news articles from 1993 when Narva actually tried to obtain autonomy in Estonia, you'd see almost verbatim a lot of these same articles or same characteristics and attributes being used to talk about Russians in Estonia and Narva. So this feeds into some of my research questions with regards to security and military and geopolitics, which include, are these representations actualized and represented on the ground? Is this what Russian speakers are really like? Is this what Narva is really like? And how might Estonian Russian speakers in Narva receive Russian military and irredentist overtures? And what do local population and place particularities and perspectives reflect? And as a geographer, we're really interested in this relationship or this importance of place, because place obviously does matter, even for security and military studies. And so I'm going to be talking about some findings, some of which are derived from interviews, and the other are derived from surveys that I conducted in Narva. So first we have citizenship and politics. Most Russian speakers in Narva, again, have a fragmented citizenship status kind of group. So less than 50% of Narva residents actually have Estonian citizenship. I think it's around 47%. And regardless of what status they have, most individuals actually desire Estonian citizenship. Estonian citizenship is considered this ideal. It's what people would like to have. They see more benefits of having Estonian citizenship than Russian or stateless residency. However, most consider it out of reach. When surveyed about citizenship, 46% said it's easy in principle or easy in theory, but in reality and practice, it's actually quite difficult to obtain. And there's a wealth of scholarship on Estonian naturalization and difficulties related to that. And this informs a steep decline in naturalization rates among Russian speakers, specifically since 2007, and a decline in electoral participation among Russian speakers. For citizenship scholars like myself, we also see emerging this idea of de facto and de jure citizens. So we have, or de facto and de jure statelessness emerging. So we have individuals who have citizenship but feel stateless or act stateless. Or we have individuals who are stateless or non-citizens who also feel like citizens and engage as citizens, which is a really interesting finding. So most Russian speakers in Narva do engage, and they do see engagement as something that's really important for civic and political life. But they do see or perceive a lot of barriers, restrictions, and what they call, or what you would call ethnicized or ethnic discrimination when it comes to being political or being civically active. And this relates to a lot of anger and frustration that many people have, particularly with Estonian citizenship and integration policies that target this region and target this population. Most people want citizenship policies to change, and that's nothing new. That's been the same since the early 1990s. When it comes to politics in general, most Russian speakers are not that interested in politics, although they are aware of what's happening primarily in Russia because that is the media space in which they live. And many do share political concerns. So the most common political interest or problem that they see in Estonia is language. And language is really divisive in Estonia, specifically language education, because Estonia has a bifurcated education system in which you have Estonian language schools and Russian language schools. And this kind of bifurcated system continues to exist. Politics in general and political systems in general are perceived as inaccessible and not representative of Russian speakers or their interests. It's less so at the local level. The political system or set of politics that are seen as the most inaccessible or not representative are actually Russia. Russian politics is perceived as the least accessible and not representative at all when compared to other scales or spaces of politics. And this was also revealed among my interviewees. So this is an excerpt from an interview with a Narva resident and Estonian citizen, and they actually work for the Estonian government and in Estonian politics. And they state, whatever they say in politics, I mean, I am enjoying lots of rights here, and I guess I'm fairly happy with the economic situation, but you cannot ignore things that are obvious, and for me, these things are what you call a glass ceiling. And the second thing is the underrepresentation of minorities in the parliament. And this is a really commonly shared sentiment, that there is this kind of perceived ethnic glass ceiling when it comes to political and civic participation, even by those individuals who were very engaged and very involved and very connected to the political system. When it comes to identity, obviously there's a wealth of scholarship on identity in the former Soviet Union, even in Estonia. So citizenship, ethnicity, and language alone do not determine identity. And in identity in this context, I'm thinking about or looking at spatial identity. So this idea of a connection between a space and your identity, your self-ascribed identity. And so I actually solicited responses in relation to a wide array of spaces, not just these three that are listed. I also included county, the EU, and the world as well. And when it came to how Russian speakers assess identity, Narva was the most pronounced, or this idea of a very strong local identity was the most important for most people. The second was Estonia, and last was Russia. So even county, even EU, and even the world was perceived as more important than Russia when it came to spatial identity. I also asked questions about this idea of homeland. And so 50% of respondents in Narva said that Estonia was their homeland, regardless of whether or not they were born in Estonia. 16% said Narva, and 6% said Russia. These were the most common responses. So we see this idea, or this notion, that identities are hybrid, plural, and inconsistent. And this was also revealed in my interviews. So this is an interviewee who is an Estonian citizen and Narva resident. And they state, I never know who I am exactly. Am I Estonian? Am I Russian? I am like half Estonian and half Russian, and I am really lucky and I really like it. And it is hard. You are stuck and you don't really feel like a person. You feel yourself like a half-broken person. And this is a really common perception. It's really difficult for people to actually articulate where they belong when it comes to a space. And so most people actually have a really hard time discussing spatial identities because they don't necessarily know where they belong. A lot of people have this kind of divided or fragmented idea of who they are. This was also reflected in the cognitive mapping exercise that I had Narva residents do. So I had individuals, this is a geographic technique where you have people draw or sketch a cognitive map or space in relation to a particular prompt or idea. So I had people map and draw their homelands. Most people actually drew Estonia in some way. That was the most common response. Narva was also a pretty common response when it came to perceptions of homeland. A lot of people drew the world as well. I did have a handful of people who did have very politicized illustrations, and this had a lot to do with the time in which I was in Estonia. So this is when the US was debating whether or not to bomb Syria in 2013. And so this actually fed a lot into how people interacted with me as an American in Narva, and even in their cognitive maps, as you can see. Lastly, I have Narva, and for those of you who aren't necessarily Narva experts or study Narva, Narva is a very divisive place in Estonia. It is seen as this kind of internal othered region in the country, which is why I was really interested in conducting my fieldwork there. And so I wanted to know how Narvans actually think about this city that is so derided often in Estonian media, and is a really common focus in Estonian security reports. And so Narvans themselves do see their spatial community as distinct, as unique, even compared to other Russian-speaking communities in Estonia. They see themselves as completely different from Russians in Tallinn, and Tallinn Russian speakers see themselves as completely different from people in Narva. Narvans, when asked to define their city, typically focus on its border proximity proximity, or this idea of being in this border region. They also talk about natural environment, which I found really surprising since this is Estonia's most industrialized part of the country. It's where the oil shale industry is. Russianness was also common, history, and also economic depression and regional isolation. And this idea of regional isolation or separateness was also a really common theme in my surveys and interviews. So you see this really strong sense of distinction, spatial distinction, community, de facto autonomy, and separateness not just from Estonia, but also from Russia. Just because individuals don't feel like they're part of Estonia doesn't infer or imply that they're part of Russia either. They see themselves as being separate from both. And this was also revealed in my interviews. So this is an Estonian citizen and a Narva resident, and they state, Narva is Russian, but European, or something like this, Russian European, something in between, because it is like an island in Estonia. And in additional interviews, most residents actually state if they leave town, they're going to Estonia. Even though Narva is in Estonia, they perceive it as being completely separate and different from the rest of the country. So when you're going to Tallinn, when you're going to Tartu, you're not going to Tallinn or Tartu, you're going to Estonia. Yeah, sure?
This sounds very similar to the way the English look at going to Europe.
Yeah.
They're going to Europe. They're not in Europe, they're going up to Europe.
Yeah, it's a very distinct kind of spatial understanding as to where they are and who the others are as well. So this informs, in conclusion and some of my implications, so Narvans and Russian speakers in general are not a monolithic community and should not be assumed to be a homogenous group associated solely with Russia or Russianness. Local particularities, perceptions, and identities matter, and many of these are highly localized, and many of these are plural and hybrid or inconsistent. While Russia is important, particularly for identity, and especially for Russian citizens, Russian identity tends to be more pronounced than with other individuals in Estonia. When it comes to comparing it to Estonia and Narva, these places matter more when it comes to perception and practice. Narvans overall favor Estonian citizenship and would want to be Estonian citizens, and they want to have an Estonian identity, and they want to participate in Estonian politics, but are very frustrated, wary, and critical of the Estonian state and policy. Narvans have also very strong localisms and place attachments, and any sort of Narva-oriented policy, initiative, or discourse, whether domestic or international, should reflect and be sensitive to these particularities and localisms. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. As per the schedule, we will have a joint question and answer period at the end of our three presenters. So next up, I would like to introduce Eric Toller, who's with Bellingcat, and he will be speaking to us on open secrets, crowdsourcing Russia's wars in Ukraine and Syria.
Yes, but I might get to Syria depending on how fast it goes. I'll start with Ukraine because that apparently is the topic here. I'm going to be bouncing around a little bit too, so yes, yell at me if I'm too quiet. Okay, so as I said here, I'm with Bellingcat, and I'll describe a little bit about what that is, that weird name, what we are, and what we do, as you'll see through here. I'm talking about kind of the crowdsourced verification and research around Russia's war in Ukraine and Syria, but mostly I'm talking about Ukraine here. I'll tag on some Syria at the end if we have some time. Okay, so what am I talking about with crowdsourcing? Well, as you see here, this is some very smart people here. They researched all the different types of weapons and tanks that popped up in Ukraine during the conflict from 2014 onwards. And on the left here, you have what's in the armament of the Ukrainian military. Right? And on the right, you have what the pro-Russian separatists are using. There's a gap, right? But it's not one-to-one. Because, of course, according to Peskov and Zakharova and Lavrov, all the Russian officials, Russia is not providing any weapons to Ukraine, and that they're all local insurgents who have just seized weapons from Ukraine, and yet the armed forces of Novorossiya have, like the third largest army in Europe, if you calculate it out, which that's not possible without there being some kind of supporter to the east. So this gives us a problem. How can we, using open source information, right, so you have videos, you have witness accounts, you have social media, everything. You have just the ubiquitous internet. This is the first war in Europe, definitely, maybe in the world, with the ubiquitous presence of the internet. Everyone has a smartphone. You have 3G throughout most parts of Ukraine, definitely in Russia. And everyone has a cell phone. And plus, in Russia and Ukraine, everyone has a dash cams, right? Because you have the insurance stuff. So you have all these videos, you have all this media of all these tanks that are rolling through towards the border and across the border. And it gives us just a huge wealth of information. And it really shows how war is going to be different going into the future. It's kind of the topic of the conversation of the conference. Going forward, and how there's going to be a citizen effort to look into the war, research it, and verify information, and fact-check the statements of both Ukraine and Russia. Because, of course, Russia lies a lot, but Ukraine does almost as much, too. So, let me give you an example. So this right here, this is the journey of one tank, right? The avalanche tank, Lavina, right? It made its way. This right here, it's not too far from Kamensk-Shaktinsky, which is in the Rostov Oblast in Russia. This is on August 22nd, if you see down here. This was posted on Vkontakte by some woman named Anna, right? So just some woman saw this. She lives in Kamensk-Shaktinsky or wherever. She's this tank, cool, takes a picture and puts on Vkontakte. Okay. And she was nice enough to put a geotag on there too. Okay. And here it is too. This is just some, random clip on YouTube. Somebody took a video, saw something wrong with your town. So cool, I'm going to work. I see a tank going through town. I'll put it on YouTube and get 2,000 views and be a minor celebrity, right? Okay, and then, oh, what's this? Right? And then this is a bunch of local miners and tractor drivers, as Putin calls them, who are posing next to that same tank. You see the INA kind of at the side there, and there are a few extra marks on there from before. Wait, oops, oh, I gave you a spoiler here. See that you get the green mark, but that white dot has been added. And this again, you see Sergei down here, and his profession is the DNR, the Donetsk People's Republic. So he's a professional soldier, I guess. And then a little bit longer, this is from Reuters, right? So here you have traditional media. This is, I think, a Reuters or an AP correspondent who took this picture, very high definition. You see here, it's in the Donbass, right? This is in Ukraine, the same tank, and it looks a little bit more rough than it was in Russia. Again, the same thing, Lavina there. And then here it is, not too far from Debaltseve, in February 2015, or January, February 2015. See 1.5 million views in this thing, and you see that same tank that's been fought and participated in Debaltseve. So right here, these are totally open sources. You got some guys on Vkontakte posting pictures from their house. You got some soldiers posing next to some tanks. You got some videos at the battle scene and just random citizens taking videos. And you have all this information. It's out there. It's just everywhere, and it's just running wild. So what we try to do is collect it, verify it, and visualize it. That's kind of what we did at Bellingcat, our big project. I'll get to that in a minute. And there are just this groundswell of citizen efforts to do this. This guy right here, some guy named Askai, I don't really know his real name. He's some blogger. He has a live journal. He's some patriotic Ukrainian, as you can tell from his picture. And he does very, very intensive study of all these tanks and all this equipment moving across the border. No one knows who he really is. I don't know. I've talked to him before. I don't know his real name or where he lives other than Ukraine. But he's now kind of an expert, and he knows more than anybody I know in the world about all these tanks that are rolling through. And he knows, when you show him a picture of a tank, he'll know exactly, like, oh yeah, that was in Rostov, and then it went over here, and here, and now it's destroyed. So he's just some random guy, anonymous guy, who's become kind of an expert on this. And this is some of the work he's done. And there's a Live UA Map, which is a site that was started as a kind of a citizen's effort. Now it's kind of more of a business. And they take all the events during the Ukrainian conflict and they stuck them on a map. They geolocated, like they found the locations of all these things, put them on a map. Map goes back to 2013, 2014. You can search events of any day that happened. And the battle lines shift, and you can see all the maps, all the events that happened on the map. Again, these are just some 2 or 3 people in Ukraine who started this effort, and now it's been going, and for historians in the future, they have all this at their disposal. And this is an effort from a more pro-Russian, pro-separatist group called Lost Armor. As you can tell, right, they say not Ukrainian, and it's the Civil War, as they call it. And this came in response to the Ukrainian, every time there's a dispatch from the anti-terrorist operation, the ATO, they always say there's no losses, right? But they're niet. And this is kind of their response of like, yes, you guys are losing a lot. Hundreds of soldiers are dying. You guys are lying to the families. And so they started this effort to document the losses of the Ukrainian army, kind of a more truthful effort. But they're kind of tilt to the pro-separatist, pro-Russian side, but they need to be verified. And here's an example of some of the stuff they do here. So that leads me to what we did at Bellingcat, our initiative we started. We called the Vehicle Tracking Program, Vehicle Tracking Project. See, I don't even know what it's called. And and what we do here is we have videos, we have discrete pieces of evidence, right? A video, news report, a picture, whatever. And I was talking earlier with the guy who's here now about how there's a lot of disinformation on both sides about what's happening. So there's a famous example about how a U.S. congressman came up and showed a picture of how some Russian tanks are rolling into Ukraine. Held a picture. Well, the picture was from 2008 with Russian tanks in Georgia. Like there are Russian tanks in Ukraine, but not there. Right? And the Ukrainians often vastly overstate the number of Russian troops and tanks in Ukraine. So we tried to provide a more accurate picture, right, from the no Russian tanks according to Russia and 5,000 according to Ukraine or whatever, right? Find a more realistic. And we did this by collecting evidence online and verifying it through crowdsourcing, and then put it all into a database. Right? So let me show it to you. This is an example in Crimea. There is a big convoy that was going up north to the border, and none of these vehicles ended up crossing the border, but still we documented it. So what we did, we put it up, and there's this platform we use called CheckDesk. And see, I am right there. And I uploaded this, and no, we didn't really know this video was taken. It was somewhere in Crimea. And so we put it up, and I said, right here, and I'm like, oh, the same column that was in John Coy later today. And then we talk. These are just random people on the internet who just make an account, sign in, talk to us, help us out, right? And eventually we work together. You see some collaboration here. We look at some other videos. We look at Google Maps and try to match the landmarks in the picture, in the video, and the picture, and match them up to the details on video and satellite and all that stuff. And we eventually find the exact coordinates where it's located. And then we can kind of mark it down, kind of having that very solid, verified, false, unclear, whatever. We can actually verify, right, or undetermined, right? So we can kind of give some solidity, actually give some like truth factor some of these claims. Like, is this true? Is this false? And so on. All right, we have a big old huge collection of videos, and these videos disappear all the time. Someone will upload them, and then after 3 or 4 days, it's mysteriously gone, and it disappears into the ether, never to be seen again. So we tried to save and document all these videos and keep them logged. Again, for the future historians who want to do this. And so here's an example of that Avalanche or Lavina tank, and we mapped where it's located, right? So the first sighting of it was in Stara Stanica, which is not too far from Kamiensk-Shaktinsky, and it was on August 29th, and then it popped up in Uglogorsk and Debaltseve in the next year. Right, and so we have a little data card here, right? So, here's a specific event, which was that video that I told you about earlier that was filmed in Kamiensk-Shaktinsky, and we kept track of all the vehicles that were in that video. Right, we kept track of them, gave them all unique IDs. So right here, the unique units, the Lavina BMP and the Motherland. There's one that said Zarodin, like for the Motherland tank, and we keep track of all these individual units because they all have numbers on their hull. They have unique writing, they have unique symbols, they have unique marks and tactical symbols and all that stuff. Right? And same thing for this data card. So you can see here the unique units, the sighting link, the coordinates, date, all the data you would ever need to keep track of all this. Right? And here's another example. This is a nice, pristine-looking vehicle in Russia. Right? So this guy, you see his profession is Armia, so he's some soldier who's very generously providing us with information. Thank you. They're being transported. This is in Russia, right? And not too long, it has a DNR flag flying up above it, right? And they've written "Not Lvov" on the bottom of it because they apparently want to go all the way to Poland. And now, apparently, they also want to go to Kiev. You see, they want to, depending on which side you look at, they're going to different places. The guys are standing on the tank, and you can track these. This is totally different. They have tactical symbols you can look for. Right, you see these like this box with the dots in the middle. Right, you can say it. You can see right there. This is in Russia, by the way. This is all in Russia. Right there, you know this is Russia, right? Because antifreeze is poison, as you see in the sign there, and which is a big problem in the army. And you see the symbol right below it, right? And then this is a different vehicle. Well, it's one of those with LNR, which is the Luhansk People's Republic, that popped up, and you can see on the left side the exact same tactical symbol. This was captured by some Ukrainian soldiers. You see there they have the Ukrainian flag on their arms. You got the LNR thing on there. There's a symbol again. And if you look inside, you can see DMB, which is Demobilization 2014. So whatever Russian soldier had this before was really excited about getting out of the army, and Kurgan Chelyabinsk, which is where they were going earlier. Oops. Right. So we got all sorts of press. That's not important. Okay. So we do get to go to Syria. Okay, great. Anyway, so in sum, what that is, we had this big database. We collected all this information, and we tried to actually provide some real verification to this just massive amounts of data that was everywhere. Right? And hopefully we were at least semi-successful. And a lot of this, and another point of all this is there are a lot of Russian tanks that never went across the border, only maybe 5-10, because we kept track of all things on both sides of the border. And there were a lot of Russian tanks that never moved. They just stayed, they went to exercise in the border, and they never moved. So we kind of saw that both sides were kind of overinflating, or in the side of Russia, underinflating the influence of Russian tanks in the conflict. Because there were a lot of actual Russian tanks that were seized by separatists of the Ukrainian army. But there are also a lot that crossed the border. And there's some very good examples of both. Okay, I'm going to talk you through very shortly through the Syrian thing now, which is probably not as interesting, but maybe you'll think it's interesting too. So the Russian Ministry of Defense, after they started their air campaign in Syria, they started publishing all of their, not all, but a great big chunk of their airstrikes. Just like kind of shock and awe propaganda. Here we are bombing ISIS, all that stuff. And when they first started their campaign, they were saying that they were bombing exclusively ISIS. We're just bombing ISIS, ISIS, ISIS. And then eventually they started saying, oh yeah, and also terrorists and Nusra and some of the other groups. So here's an example of this. They said that they were bombing a oil refinery in some Syrian city. I can't remember the city off the top of my head. All right, nice propaganda footage. Everyone's thinking, oh wow, we're really killing ISIS. We're killing their, they make all this money off this oil. Good job, Russia. Well, let's see, right? Well, what we did is we had this project where we took all their videos, every single one of these videos the Ministry of Defense uploaded. This is their material. We took it and we located where each of these videos were actually filmed. So they say, okay, this is a strike on a Russian, on an ISIS base in Raqqa, right? Well, we look and it's actually 150 kilometers from Raqqa, and they're hitting some random anti-Assad rebel group, right? Well, yes, there's still probably, you could still probably call these guys terrorists, but they're not ISIS. So, yeah, a little bit of a fib. And so we went through and we located all of these strikes. And you see it's about 50-50 there, about ones that were correctly labeled with both the target and location, and then all the red ones are the untrue ones. You see here is far in the east, that's where ISIS is actually located. That's where all the true ones are. Now in the west, which is where the Syrian offensive against the rebels happened, out by Latakia, that's where they fibbed a little bit. Oh, this, by the way, we found this, and it was actually a water purification plant, not an oil refinery. So we kind of did a verification fact check effort for both where things were happening and what they were hitting. So they say they were hitting an oil refinery, and it kind of looks like that in black and white, right? But when you actually see it, it's water purification, right? And that's something you probably shouldn't hit with an airstrike. Maybe they knew, maybe they don't, but I don't know. We do this from other things too, not just all Russia bad, though they give us the most material. So, for example, we're keeping track of the tow missiles that are mostly provided by the United States, and where they go and who uses them. So they were supposed to be used by so-called moderate groups, the Free Syrian Army and some other places, but they find their owners fairly fast. So we keep track of who's using them and who they're getting hit. So a lot of times it'll be taken by random groups, and then the Kurds get attacked with these things that we bought. And of course we support the Kurds, so then we're using American weapons against the Kurds, and it's a mess. We do the same thing where we fact check where things are located. We do the same thing for the UK airstrikes and the US coalition airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. They are much more accurate, but we also try to combine that with casualty reports and saying, yes, you did hit this, great job, you hit this ISIS, but 8 civilians died. So you should have said that too. Here's an example here, and that's all I have. So that's kind of showing the future changing way of warfare, is that there's so much propaganda out there, but with the propaganda efforts, because no matter who's fighting war, they always have the information warfare going on. But with that, they also have the other side, is you can verify them and seeing what they're saying is true, what's half true, so what's flat out lies. And hopefully there's no more wars in Europe, but if there are, then we'll see the same thing again, to where we have the ubiquitous internet, everyone have a smartphone, and you can fact check everything that's going on. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And the last presenter, but not the least, no pressure there. We have Roger Kangas, who is with the Near East South Asian. Is there any other direction you'd like to add in there?
No, that's enough.
Center for Strategic Studies. And he will be speaking about the Arc of Instability Revisited, NATO's Southern Tier, and the Middle East.
Yeah, we're just going to kind of take the conversation a little southward. I will put the timepiece on because I am absolutely unable to tell time by feel. I could go on for 2 hours, and I'll try not to do that. No, first of all, thanks for having me as part of this event, and it was interesting sort of hearing some of the comments made earlier. In fact, Adrian's presentation today when he was introduced, one of his earlier accomplishments was working for Freedom House during a big stretch of time, and I'm proud to say I was one of the writers for the Central Asian country studies back in the late 1990s. On record as giving the first 7 to a country. Yay. Of course, yeah, it's pretty easy to do that for a few of them. But now this discussion in this session, when we're looking at, and I would call it sort of from the micro to the macro level discussion, looking at some of the challenges and concerns in Estonia, and then taking us through Ukraine, which obviously was the part of the earlier presentation. We're looking at some of the real indicators or factors and trying to analyze these conflicts. How do we better understand them? And to be honest, as I sort of take a step back and look at it from the, if you want to say, the national perspective or the strategic perspective, unfortunately, are we hitting? Are these issues still not sufficient to cause attention or to cause nations to actually pay attention to the conflicts and to get engaged? Because as I look at this, and particularly as we are looking at these real threats along Russia's borders, and Russia as a potential aggressor, if we want to call that, or at least a concern for NATO, which it is, seen that way, and that in fact we have wars in Europe. We do have a war in Europe, although Europeans and Americans don't like to use that word. We call it a conflict, a disturbance, a problem, even civil war. No, it's a real conflict. It's a state invasion, and it's happened twice. And so, we're loath to do that, partly because we've been conditioned over the last decade and a half to get engaged in conflicts and then to realize we can't extricate ourselves, and we have a difficult time figuring out the significance of that, which is why I wanted to, in sort of conversation with the folks here, to revisit this theme that hopefully should have died, and it keeps coming back, this notion of the arc of instability. And I only put that it's a term that came out some time ago. Thomas Barnett, among others, would talk about this region of the world where there's perpetual conflict and confusion. And of course, we, the advanced West, would have to rethink our strategies to them. Do we engage? Do we block it off? Do we build big walls? I know that's kind of a popular strategy these days. And so, how do we engage in it? Well, I'm going to take it to a simple level and say, if we look at a couple of instances where this has happened, and for the sake of time, I will really skate through these. But if you look at, Afghanistan, Iran, Syria as examples of arc of instability actors, we can see the impact that these conflicts have had on the U.S., NATO, but also on Russia. And again, I think it was appropriate to bring in the Russian-Syrian issue in terms of their engagement, and sort of get us to a so what question. What might this mean for security challenges? And I'll just add one quick kind of aside. It's even difficult for us to come to terms with this region, and I only highlight this as a modest example. Even our State Department and Defense Department don't always quite think of this geography in the same way. We like to position ourselves and condition ourselves in different directions. And so to come up with viable strategies from one country's problematic to put it into a series of countries is quite something else. And so just kind of looking at these three quick scenarios, what can they offer? What sort of words of wisdom can they provide to us? First, of course, is this wonderful problem of Afghanistan that we kind of wish would go away, that wouldn't be there. If you look at news coverage, it has gone away. It's not in the papers anymore. It's not on television. Political leaders that discuss it in the U.S. keep it to a minimum. In fact, the staffing on Afghanistan has been reduced significantly, whether it's the offices at Central Command or the offices in Washington. And yet there still is a conflict going on. There still is a problem here. The question is now we're looking at solutions. In fact, in my office, we were told, how can we write the wrap-up report for this conflict? You know, it's over, so let's now think of what sort of long-drawn conclusions we can have. One of my conclusions is we still need to wait about 20 years before we can discuss conclusions, because it will be going on for another 20 years or so. I said that 15 years ago and people didn't like it, and so we're just going to continue the timeline. But one thing to think about is as we reconnect, it is about tying it to other states, and this is part of a newer strategy or a new approach. But it's also now looking at these longer-term challenges, and the longer-term challenges really tend to be internal. You know, security, yes, we have an insurgency, and it's a viable one. But the more important ones are the economic concerns, the demographic bulge in this country, where you're going to have a GDP growth rate of about 10 to 12% a year just to keep even. Good luck with that. It's going to be difficult. And you put in this context a separation, and this is where it comes into play as this arc of instability. We believe that the conflict has been settled. We believe that this challenge is largely over, so we can draw down. Now, this is not necessarily a nefarious plot. In fact, if you look at the longer-term troop deployments, we're actually, you sort of see that we had an aberration in 2009, 2010 with this so-called mini surge. It's actually a significant surge. U.S. forces went to just over 100,000, and with the Allied components, it went to 152,000. But now we're at 9,800 roughly American troops. Actually, it's even a little less than that, and another 5,000 European and other Allied troops in the country. One of the issues is, would this remain a constant, or would we look at the forces in Afghanistan actually going to zero? A year ago, I would say by January of 2017, we'd have zero forces in Afghanistan because that was a political pledge made by President Obama back in his 2008 campaign. He's changed his thinking on this, and you actually find from the White House an understanding that we're going to have somewhere between 5,000 and 9,000. I was at NATO earlier this week, and they're still vexed with this issue. Well, what's it going to be, United States? Is it 5,000? Is it 9,800? Give a number, because the other states are all waiting to see where they could fit in. Interestingly, you could very well see one of the top 5 troop contributors being Georgia, because so many European states or traditional European NATO allies are pulling their forces out. It's actually other countries like Ukraine, Georgia are putting in their forces. Now, so what? What does this mean? I'll kind of pass over the NATO drawdown and get to the specific partner or threat question, because this is important when we think in terms of this supposed arc of instability and how do we deal with cross-border conflicts. Afghanistan itself today has uneasy relations with its neighbors. That's an understatement. If you think of Pakistan, if you think of Iran, if you think of China, and yes, even if you think of that distant neighbor, Russia. Interestingly, Russia's viewed as a neighbor, and then there's usually a comma, and then there are the Central Asian states, which of course are wedged between Russia and Afghanistan. And for each of these, with the neighborhood, it's about economic concerns, the viability of transit, trade, traffic, etc., but it's also about the security, managing it. And again, you find from a number of the states, they're playing a much bigger role. What's absent from this discourse is us. It's interesting if you look in terms of intra-Central Asian or conversations around Afghanistan. It's already assumed that we're exiting. In recent discussions between U.S., Pakistani, Chinese, and Afghan officials, in many ways it's a handover process. Okay, Americans, give us your kind of advice as we carry onward. There's an assumption that we're exiting. An interesting approach to this so-called arc of instability. We have a second case study, Iran. A little more quick on this. It's a country that At least from an American perspective, and what the great thing is, of course, I can always say these are my own views and not that of the U.S. government, the Nices Center National Defense University, or anybody in the greater Washington, D.C. area, is, Iran is usually viewed as a negative. That's an understatement, right? It's usually viewed as a meddlesome country, supporting insurgents and violence in these particular 4 states, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, the Shia Crescent. If we think of arc of instability, the Sunni Arab states in the Gulf love to talk about the Shia Crescent and how this is a way in which Iran is trying to manipulate and control the region. And in fact, our actions, U.S. and Western actions in Iraq and Afghanistan in many ways have helped create this environment. It has weakened other states, and it has allowed Iran to play a much greater role. You look to the West. Iran has a 2-track policy with Afghanistan. Yes, they are supporting the government. They have aid programs and economic development efforts. At the same time, they're also channeling weapons to opposition forces, Taliban in particular, which is really ironic considering that Iran almost went to war with Taliban Afghanistan back in the late 1990s. And so you have this hedging bets strategy going to their east, I should say, towards Afghanistan. What does this mean? Kind of what's the big issue? I had already mentioned this Sunni-Shia divide. From the American perspective, I think sometimes we overblow this. We're sort of waiting for a sectarian war to take place, and I would almost want to dismiss this out of hand. And yet, in the region, you do find the rhetoric on sectarian differences increase. Whereas before, Sunni-Shia discussions were, diplomatic, but sometimes tense. Now they can be downright hostile. And this is even among government officials, let alone sort of folks on the street and what you see in the media, what you see on different websites, what you see in different newspapers in the region. Now, whether this is actually a cause for war, let's hold on that. The issue that is making people a bit nervous is actually this one. Now, wait a second. You're thinking this should be a celebratory moment, right? The world, at least in general, held happy celebrations the day the P5+1 or EU 3+3 discussion was settled, whichever you like to call it. And there was obviously a lot of good out of this. However, you see in the neighborhood, and it's not just from Israel, but it's from Saudi Arabia, it's from United Arab Emirates, it's from Qatar, it's from Bahrain, a great deal of concern that this is basically enabling and empowering Iran to be not to be a limited actor anymore, but now to be a true regional player. And in fact, if you look at the number of flights to Tehran from countries around the world, I always want to say Europeans, but it's the same for Russians, it's the same for Chinese, it's the same for other states. Iran is now a place of destination. If you're a business, if you want to do military sales, that's going to come down the pike. You're starting to see Iran engage in a broader context. If we look at the impact of the nuclear deal, it's Iran's connectivity with the rest of the community of nations, of getting them involved in a positive way, but also in a negative way. Now, I throw this line here. What does this mean for Afghanistan, tying it to the last session? It means that we're actually drawing or connecting now some of these dots east to west, so to speak. And we can discuss this, and if you have questions on this, I mean, it's a mixed bag, because from the Iranian perspective, there is not a unified view, and I think we should be clear. Within Tehran and within particularly the Iranian academic community, there's a lot of discussion about, are we selling something short, and what sort of internal divides do we have? They have elections coming up next year, 2017, and this is going to be a hot issue, even as controversial as it is in the United States, which, by the way, every candidate but one that's currently a viable candidate in the U.S. presidential race, all but one have said they would trash the Iran deal one of the first days in office. The one exception is actually Donald Trump. Even Hillary Clinton says she doesn't like it. Now, she did say that at AIPAC, so that might have colored the view, but the other candidates are pretty clear in their opposition to it. But that's irrelevant. It's actually moved on. Other countries have sort of taken the lead on this, and we will see a different or engaged Iran. But this does lead us to the third and final one, a conflict that Iran does play a role in, among others. And this actually ties into the last discussion. Because when we look at this arc of instability, well, believe it or not, this is the area of instability. These last issues were a concluding conflict, or at least one that's going to remain at a strange simmer. A second one that's really not a conflict yet, but more of a war of words. But what we see here is a true war. And it's we're looking at what I say competing defense relation structures. Everybody's involved in this. It's not quite a proxy conflict. It's not a proxy conflict. But what you are seeing is actors within Syria, in particular, shaping the narrative within that country and allowing other states or bringing in other states to play roles. And so when we talk about pro-Assad, anti-Assad forces, Kurdish forces, it gets really complicated. And in fact, usually it takes a good humorist, a cartoonist, to draw maps or wiring diagrams of the enemy is the friend of my enemy, kind of last week, so to speak. This gets to be really problematic. And so when we look, for example, at the pro-Assad countries, Iran, Russia, there are reasons to get involved, and we can spend a lot of time on that. If all I were to say was stop terrorism and help our buddy, yeah, that's kind of the Russian approach. It also increased their credibility factor in the Middle East significantly at such a low cost. If you think of the hundreds of billions of dollars the U.S. has spent in the Middle East, the recent Russian engagement, it cost millions, but it wasn't an expensive effort. They lost a pilot. That's okay. They named a school after him. It's good. There really wasn't a concern. Putin didn't lose a bit of sleep on this. And what did he get? He got a seat at the table. He's seen as a credible actor in this part of the arc of instability. For the anti-Assad countries, what we're seeing now is disunity. We're seeing Turkey, the United States, the Gulf Arab states, all having problems with each other, in part because how they're shaping their views of this conflict. Is it anti-Kurdish? Is it anti-Shia? Is it anti-Assad? We have different challenges. And we throw in this little boogeyman. We have the problems of this sort of extra theater challenge that we use not necessarily as a real conflict, but as a good way to frame our terms. It's about ISIS. The U.S. does this, other states do it. And to some extent, this is what ties us all together. If we're looking at a possible, real, unstable action, it is the movement of peoples. You know, we mentioned, if you want to say, migrants and migration issues. And it's not the challenge that we see for many unfortunate migrants who are now in Europe, but the transition of individuals who support the Islamic State through this now non-state challenge in Syria. In fact, I have to show this one as we're connecting it to this conference. You hear even out of Russia the notion of calling this, the sort of modern day or our 21st century Stalingrad. What does this mean? From a Russian commentator, he was saying basically, if we don't stop them here, sort of, I guess in the Eastern Mediterranean, I don't know. The terrorists are going to sweep into our soft underbelly, and you see, in fact, the nice routes that they've marked in. This is actually a map from just religious organizations, and I liked how someone sort of drew sort of the charts upward. But there is truth to this in the sense of when countries are couching their terms of how they want to engage in this region, we need to take heed. And just sort of as a last comment, and I'll end on this. Kind of a quick thought, because as we're talking about Russian engagement in Estonia, Russian engagement in Ukraine, whether it's Crimea or the Donbass region, what kind of conflict is this? And I would say it's actually more of a moment of opportunity. I wouldn't conflate it and put it in the category of what we heard earlier, simply because Russia's goals were much more limited. This is not about control. This is not about destabilizing a neighbor. Again, this is about playing a specific role in Syria, and now we have one of the reasons why the Syrian conflict is spreading a bit more, and of course that's its relationship with Turkey. And just as a quick example to end, it's, we look at the November 24th episode, the shoot down of the Russian fighter, 17 seconds over Turkish airspace. Oops, that's 1 second too many. The Americans now might have to shake their fist because we're getting the same treatment, by the way, in terms of our forces. The Turks did probably what they could, but at least in their mind they should have done. The reaction has been a bit strange in the sense of Turkey feels that, one, Russia deserved it, and secondly, Russia's too weak to do anything to them. they have an Article 5 sort of safety net. Don't count on it. I wouldn't count on other NATO allies supporting Turkey in any problem with Russia. Not quite yet. And what you're getting from the Russian side, at least, is a wonderful verbal barrage. Turkey is a state sponsor of terrorism. Let's have an embargo, so no more Russians going to Turkish vacation spots. Support for the PKK. Interesting rumor, and I would love to see if Bellingcat can now look at Russian equipment that's in the hands of the PKK. It wouldn't surprise me. But is this something we need to think about when we look at this region? And I would say, kind of in a quick end comment, yes. Happy to chat about it more. I'll leave it at this for sake of time, and so we can move to some questions. So I'll turn it back to you, Shannon.
Thank you, Roger.
I have a question for Mr. Toller. You know, I read the Bellingcat report on your downing of MH17, and I wonder, did you see a severe reduction in Russian social media entries by Russian soldiers after that incident? And kind of a follow-on question, why do you think the United States hasn't released some of their intelligence on who actually shot that airliner down? Thanks.
Yeah, they did, like, big time, reduce. After we did the report, almost every soldier in that brigade, the 5030 Anti-Aircraft Brigade, which we said shot down the plane, deleted their profile or deleted all their military stuff or changed their name, even though their URL to their profile stayed the same. So they went from Vladimir to Dmitry, but it's your profile's in the same URL, so it doesn't matter. So, yeah. Yeah, they did. There was a severe reduction, and right now it's a lot harder to find. Well, first of all, there are fewer Russian soldiers in Ukraine now, and also even when it was spiking, there was a reduced reduction because they figured out they're going to get in trouble. And secondly, with the U.S. intel thing, I know it's frustrating. I know that they have. If you read the DSA, the Dutch Safety Board, and the Joint Investigation Team, they're the two, the technical and the criminal investigations in MH17. If you read closely between the lines, the U.S. has shared intelligence with them. They've shared. There are no actual satellite photos of it happening because it was too cloudy and all. But there are SBIR. I don't know exact. I'm not technical expert, but it's more or less like radar. It detects flashes and stuff like that. And they did share some of that with the investigation. So why aren't they showing us? Well, either bureaucracy or they just want to reveal. I mean, they always say they don't want to reveal capabilities, or maybe it's not entirely clear. Like maybe it's not as much of a slam dunk, or maybe it's kind of murky evidence, and they just don't want to deal with it. But honestly, I'm not totally sure. But I mean, the answer is probably something to do with capabilities. They don't want to reveal. At least that's what they say.
Hi, my question is also for Mr. Toller. What degree have you seen governments and organizations trying to clean up some of the media trails that they've left and acting kind of against your organization?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as far as states cleaning up trails, I can't directly attribute it to us, but as I was talking earlier about the Russian Ministry of Defense publishing the Syrian airstrike videos, when they first started doing this, they were explicitly saying we're only hitting ISIS, and if you read the statements from the Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they say we're only hitting ISIS, we're not hitting other groups. We're only killing ISIS here. That's the goal of our intervention. And after a while, us and others were publishing reports saying, okay, maybe you're like 20% of your airstrikes against ISIS, but the rest are against al-Nusra and other groups that are no good. I mean, they probably deserve plenty of airstrikes, and also some more moderate groups that are U.S. supported and U.S. aided as support for the Syrian ground offensive. And then after a while, after a few months, they started renaming their videos and presenting them in different ways, in a little bit more honest way of saying, this is against the Nusra Front, this is against, vague terrorists, which you can call anyone a terrorist, especially because the Assad government considers anyone who's fighting against them to be a terrorist. So possibly that was a reaction. I don't know directly to us or to others. And they've, as far as the response of them against us, their Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Foreign Affairs have both trashed us a lot in their press conferences. They don't like us. They say we're CIA fronted, which I know we aren't. no, I applied for the CA after I graduated, and they wouldn't even interview me. So we're not CIA funded. But yeah, I mean, we're like a kind of a generic boogeyman now, as like we're seen as an arm of the whatever, you know, the Mossad or the SBU or the MI, whoever the boogeyman. Before long, we're going to be part of the Grey Wolves or something with Turkey. But I don't even know what's going to happen next. Even though we've published some reports about how Erdogan is not a nice guy. But yeah, so it's been a very negative reaction from governments.
Dr. Congas, there have been calls. The United States is helping trying to defeat the Islamists, the terrorists in Syria. There have been calls lately for more of the Arab countries, maybe Arab countries, to contribute more to the effort than they are now, like maybe twisting their arms. What do you think is the possibility of having the Arab countries do more?
I'd say pretty simple. Some of them are actually committing troops, although their motivations are, you know, so for example, you know, if the Turks, not Arabs, they're focusing largely on the Kurdish communities. The Arab forces, Emirati Air Force in particular, they're trying to hit ISIS sites, but they actually tend to hit more the al-Nusra sites and others. There's an odd distancing between Saudi Arabia and ISIS or Daesh forces. There's some who like to, in sort of grand conspiracy theories, say that there's a Saudi preference for that to keep them going, because if you have these Sunni extremists, you're going to, one, damage the Shia arc of instability, and secondly, go after some of the key individuals that oppose your state, not just Tehran, but you could also look at Assad. I don't know if I really want to buy into that. I think that what you find is really limited capabilities. Let's take sort of the Occam's razor approach. That is the simplest answer, and it is limited capabilities, so they're doing certain strikes. Their air forces are actually now overly deployed. They got involved in Yemen, which has not been, you know, they're declaring almost mission accomplished, but it's far from over, and it's actually becoming a pretty nasty conflict for them, both for the Saudis and the Emiratis, who are probably more seriously engaged. I think they're really sort of testing and finding the limits of their military capabilities. Unfortunately, they're not as good as they thought, and this has been a learning curve for them, and when they've hit some serious casualties, it's actually taken them aback. I don't think they expected it. And so, you know, could they play a bigger role? Yes, but they've already been tapped, and I'm thinking specifically of the Gulf Arab states. For some of the others, you know, the bigger armies, you know, Egypt, they're basically incapable right now of doing anything because of the internal implosions in that country. Jordan, I'll be honest, they need to focus on their own internal stability and the border situation with the refugees across. They don't have the capability to project power. And so you're finding other countries just unable to join in the fray. Unfortunately, that means we end up, among others, having to do a lot of the heavy lifting in the region, which is almost exactly what we don't want to do. But yeah, no, excellent question.